She felt his gaze before she understood anything else, a cold and steady force that brushed against her with such quiet intensity that the entire room seemed to pause for a single breath. Grace Whittaker did not know who he was, had never heard his name, had no explanation for why one effortless glance from him could send a chill racing down her spine. But that was not the worst part. The worst part was the reckless thing she was about to do. Something even she recognized as foolish. She was about to approach a complete stranger and ask him to pretend to be her boyfriend, all to prove to the man who had betrayed her that she had moved on. Yet the ache tightening in her chest, the humiliation that pulsed every time she looked toward Ethan Walsh, and the proud smile on his lips as he escorted a model-beautiful young woman into the evening fundraiser at the Fairmont Copley, pushed Grace far beyond the fragile edge of her dignity. Barely half a minute earlier, she had crossed the red-carpeted ballroom like a woman with a plan. She believed she was strong enough to face Ethan after the marriage had collapsed under deceit. He was the one who suggested they could still be friends. The one who sent the invitation to this event with gentle, courteous words, as if he had never wounded her. And then he arrived with a tall, fresh-faced blonde whose red lips curved with bold confidence, her hand curled around Ethan's arm as though she had belonged there for a very long time. Ethan smiled at Grace with an expression that was both falsely apologetic and quietly triumphant, and the sting of it felt like a slap across the thin layer of self-respect she had left. Sarah, her closest friend, whispered, "Grace, stop looking, turn away. You do not need to be strong like this." But Grace kept watching, because pain has a way of making people behave in ways they never imagined. And then she saw him. The man standing by the bar at the far end of the room, dressed in a simple, black suit that no one else could have worn with such composed authority. A silver-faced watch rested against his wrist, his broad shoulders forming a firm, disciplined line beneath the fabric, and his face angular, quiet, the kind that belonged to someone accustomed to standing apart from a crowd while observing everything. His eyes moved slowly across the room, deliberate, controlled, and when they landed on Grace, she felt rooted to the floor. Sarah tugged her arm, trying to pull her back. Grace did not listen. She drew in a long breath to gather the last of her pride and walked straight toward him, her heels striking the polished floor with the sharp rhythm of recklessness. She had no plan, no strategy, only the raw ache in her chest and the mocking memory of the man who once claimed to love her. When she reached him, she could hear her own heartbeat. "I need your help," she said softly but firmly, keeping her spine straight. "Can you pretend to be my man? Just for tonight?" He looked at her for so long she nearly turned around and fled. Then the corner of his mouth lifted, not a smile, but something sharper, something dangerously intrigued. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low and deep, as if it rose from someplace beneath the noise of the crowded room. "Yes," Grace lied, because she was not sure of anything. And before she could reconsider, he placed his hand on her waist. His touch was warm, steady, commanding in a way that stole the breath from her chest. The entire room seemed to freeze. Grace had no idea what she had just done. She only knew that when he leaned closer and murmured into her ear, in a voice soft and dark and dangerous, "Calm down. I will not hurt you." Her body did not calm at all. It trembled, and everything, the golden lights, the distant laughter blurred at the edges, until all she could feel was his hand and the reckless choice she had just made. Before moving on to what comes next, if you feel your own heartbeat quicken with Grace's, if the cold, unreadable eyes of the mysterious man send a shiver down your spine, yet keep you unable to look away, do not forget to subscribe so you never miss the next chapter of this story. We bring you emotional, suspenseful, deeply human stories every single day. And if you are watching this from anywhere, your warm kitchen, your familiar cafe, or a quiet bedroom at night, leave a comment telling us where you are listening from, so we know where this story has traveled on your emotional map. And if you believe Grace deserves to be loved, or if you have ever lived through a moment like hers, reckless, painful, unforgettable, please like and share this video with someone who needs to hear it too. Now, are you ready? The story between Grace and Nicholas is only beginning. Grace did not know why he agreed. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps amusement, or something far more complicated, something she could not foresee. But when he shifted slightly, to let her stand beside him as though he had been her companion for a long time, she felt herself crossing a door she could never step back through. He did not ask questions, did not judge her impulsive decision. Instead, he lifted the glass in his hand, took a quiet sip, and behaved as though pretending to be the boyfriend of a stranger at a glamorous event was a minor footnote in an already complex life. Grace glanced over her shoulder and saw Ethan near the buffet, his hand resting lightly on the young blonde's back. He had turned, now paying attention to her presence beside the unfamiliar man. Grace stepped closer to Nicholas, acutely aware of his hand still resting at her waist. He did not withdraw. Instead, his thumb moved in a subtle stroke, a small shift that sent a ripple through her entire body. She was not accustomed to being touched like that, not in a sensual way, but in a way that made her feel tethered to something she could not control. "Thank you," she murmured, her eyes fixed on Ethan. "I do not know what I am doing, You are doing exactly what you believe you need to do," Nicholas replied, his voice calm, almost lazy, yet sharpened by something she could not name. "To make someone jealous, correct?" Grace stiffened slightly but did not deny it. "My name is Grace," she said quickly. "And you are?" "Nicholas," he answered. Just one word. No surname, no anchor, only a gift with boundaries, a name without a door to open. Though he did not look at her, his eyes continued to scan the crowd, observing, absorbing, calculating. Grace wondered what kind of man he was. A businessman? A security consultant? Or simply a wealthy, solitary man seeking a moment of amusement in an otherwise tedious night? Whatever he was, she knew one thing. Nicholas was not ordinary. He was not someone one could approach lightly, nor the kind of man she could ask to play her lover in front of an ex-husband and then walk away from without consequence. Yet she had done exactly that, and Nicholas had accepted. "Do you not find this strange?" she asked quietly. He finally met her eyes, a gaze unhurried, unsurprised, silent, fully controlled. "I have seen stranger things," he said, then leaned in, his breath brushing her ear. "Just play your part well. I will handle the rest." Grace's heart pounded so fiercely she nearly forgot her original purpose. Suddenly the pretense no longer felt simple. Suddenly Nicholas's gaze was not merely a tool meant to provoke jealousy. It was cutting through her, reading every hidden bruise beneath her flawless makeup. And when Ethan began moving toward them, hesitant steps, his attention locked on Nicholas's hand, still resting on her waist, Grace knew she had lit a fire no one could extinguish. Ethan stopped only a few steps away, his eyes caught between disbelief and suspicion, as he took in the sight of Grace, standing in the hold of a man he had never seen before. The familiar smile that usually rested on Ethan's face vanished, replaced by a frown he could not hide. "Grace," he said, his voice pitched slightly higher than usual, as though he could not trust what he was seeing. "What is going on?" Grace kept her expression calm, though every cell in her body trembled beneath the surface. She had no script, no backup plan, nothing except Nicholas, the man beside her, whose unnervingly steady composure made it seem as if everything unfolding was something he had already anticipated. Nicholas did not speak at first. He merely tilted his head slightly, as though assessing Ethan from top to bottom. That quiet, measuring look made Ethan freeze, as if someone had forced him to stand beneath a spotlight without a single line to speak. "Ethan," Grace said before the silence grew too taut, striving to sound gentle without being weak. "This is Nicholas." She intentionally added nothing more. No labels, no explanations. She left, the space open, and Nicholas stepped into it. Nicholas turned toward Ethan and met his gaze without a flicker of expression. "I am the one she chose," he said slowly, each word falling with the cold precision of a blade. "And I do not believe she owes you an explanation." Ethan blinked, taking half a step back. I am not demanding one," he stammered, though his eyes betrayed him. They were full of doubt, anger, and a wounded pride he refused to acknowledge. "I am just surprised. We are friends. Or at least I thought we were." "Friends?" Nicholas's mouth curved faintly. Not quite a smile, not quite contempt. Friends do not bring another woman to an event where they invited their former spouse to accompany them. His voice remained low and even, never rising, yet the weight of it struck Ethan hard enough to silence him. Grace stood still, stunned. She had not expected Nicholas to understand the situation so quickly, much less speak truths she herself had not fully allowed to surface. Ethan's gaze slipped to Nicholas's hand still resting on her waist. "I just did not know she was," "Seeing someone," he offered, the excuse sounding thin even to himself. "She does not have to inform you," Nicholas replied, his eyes fixed on Ethan. "You gave up that right the moment you chose to betray her." The final sentence dropped like a hammer. Ethan opened his mouth but found nothing to defend himself with. Around them, people began to notice, their polite attempts at discretion failing as their eyes drifted curiously toward the trio. Grace felt her heartbeat pounding like a drum. Never once in her life had anyone stepped between her and Ethan on her behalf. Ethan retreated another small step, clearly unaccustomed to being pushed back without any ground left to regain. "I do not want any trouble," he murmured, watching Nicholas with caution. "Good," Nicholas replied, "because even if you did, you would not be capable of it." Ethan's jaw tightened. He turned away without another word, his shadow slipping into the lively crowd until he disappeared entirely. Nicholas remained still, withdrawing his hand from her waist only after Ethan had vanished from sight. Grace turned to him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You did not have to do that," she whispered. Nicholas tilted his head slightly. "No," he said, "but I wanted to, because he needed to understand something." "What is that?" Grace asked softly. Nicholas leaned in, the space between them collapsing until she could feel the warmth of his breath. "That from this moment on, you are no longer his." Grace's heart stumbled in her chest. She did not know what exactly was happening, but she felt it clearly. She had stepped into the center of a storm she could not yet name. Nicholas remained silent for several seconds after that, as if allowing his words to sink into her blood. She could not look away from him, her heart beating so rapidly that it felt as though her entire body pulsed with it. Before she could respond, Nicholas touched her back, his palm settling between her shoulder blades and her waist, a gesture both gentle and unmistakably guiding. "We are going outside," he said, not offering it as a suggestion. Grace hesitated for a moment before nodding, because staying in that stifling ballroom where eyes were beginning to follow her and whispers were already forming felt far worse than following a man whose name she had known for less than 10 minutes. Nicholas led her through the crowd, his hand steady against her back like an invisible anchor. When they finally reached the Grand Hotel lobby, the cool air drifting across the marble hall eased her breath. He remained silent. Only when they turned into a quiet corridor behind the event hall, the lighting softer and removed from the clinking glasses and music, did Nicholas finally stop. He stood before her, not touching, not smiling, but watching, her with eyes as sharp as aged steel. "You have placed yourself in a world you do not understand," he said slowly. "And worse, you pulled me into it with you." Grace frowned. I did not mean to cause you trouble. I just wanted—" "When you walked up and touched me," he cut in, his voice still measured but edged with something colder, "you made a statement." "To whom?" Grace asked, confused. Nicholas held her gaze without wavering. "To anyone in that room who knows who I am." Grace stepped back. The air changed around her, tightening, as though she had brushed up against something dangerous, not the impulsive kind sparked by hurt feelings, but something with far broader consequences. "Who are you?" she whispered. Nicholas did not answer immediately. Then he stepped closer, not threatening, but not allowing distance either. "Grace," he said, using her name for the first time, his voice so low it was nearly a whisper. "I am not a man people use for jealousy games. I do not participate in social theatrics. I am the kind of person whose presence raises questions. And if anyone in that room draws the wrong conclusions, you may end up paying for it." A cold tremor slid down her spine. "Are you threatening me?" "I am protecting you," Nicholas answered instantly. "Because from the moment you touched me, a few sets of eyes began watching. And not all of them were the kind that watch out of simple curiosity." She swallowed hard. "You are saying someone is monitoring me?" "You are being noticed," he corrected. "And I am not convinced it is attention you are prepared to handle alone." The hallway felt smaller, the elegant hotel fading into shadows and muted light. The fundraiser, the refined conversations, the glittering chandeliers, all of it fell away until only the dim corridor remained, and the man standing before her, both a shield and a doorway into something far larger than she imagined. "Why?" she asked. "I am just an ordinary person. I have nothing to do with your world. I just wanted Ethan to see that he does not control me anymore." Nicholas nodded once, a glimmer of something like regret glinting in his eyes. I believe you. But what is done, and the truth is, he said, his voice dropping heavier with each word, when someone appears beside me in a public space, they are no longer ordinary. Grace stared at him, her heartbeat stumbling as confusion tangled with fear. She did not fully understand yet, but her instincts told her the night would not end when the fundraiser did. Nicholas slipped a phone from his pocket, his fingers moving quickly across the screen before he held it out to her. A photograph filled the display. It was her, standing beside him, taken only minutes earlier but from a different angle, clearly from a hidden lens. Nicholas watched her, not giving her time to speak. This was sent to my phone 1 minute after we left the ballroom. Grace went still. She did not know who took it or why, but one thing she understood with absolute clarity was that she had stepped into something far beyond her control. Nicholas tucked the phone away and spoke quietly but decisively. We are leaving, right now. The black car slid quietly through the tree-lined streets of Beacon Hill, moving in silence. Grace sat by the window, her hands gripping her handbag tightly, her eyes fixed straight ahead yet seeing nothing except the sweep of passing lights. Beside her, Nicholas made several phone calls in that low voice of his English precise and clean but sharp as a blade, each short, decisive command making her feel as if she were sitting next to someone who did not belong to the world she knew. When the car stopped in front of a high-end red brick building with guards posted at the entrance, Grace felt as though she had stepped into a film. Nicholas did not explain, did not ask for her opinion. He simply opened the car door and turned to her with one quiet sentence. Trust me, you can ask your questions afterward. She followed him, not entirely because she trusted him, but because she had no other choice. The penthouse was on the top floor, reached by a private elevator, with glass walls overlooking the city glittering with lights. The interior was luxurious without being ostentatious, the kind of design that made it clear its owner had nothing to prove to anyone. Nicholas told her to sit, poured her a glass of water, and then stepped into another room to make more calls. She sat on the wide gray sofa, her eyes wandering. There were no signs of ordinary life in the apartment. No personal photographs, no flowers, none of the gentle clutter that usually revealed a human presence. Everything was arranged as if this were a space built to protect, conceal, and control, and suddenly Grace felt more awake than she had all night. What had happened this evening felt like a sudden storm, fast and violent, sweeping her along before she could understand what was truly taking place. Why did Nicholas care about her at all? How did he seem to know more than he was saying? And that photograph, who had sent it? How did they even have his number? She rose and walked quietly around the room, her gaze touching each detail as if searching for something that might make her feel less unmoored. On the bookshelf were volumes on strategy and history, along with financial documents in Italian and Russian. On the table sat a closed laptop. Grace brushed her fingertips lightly over its smooth, cold surface and turned when she heard footsteps. Nicholas emerged from the hallway, his jacket removed now, a glass of liquor in his hand, his expression as composed as if no one had ever intruded on his evening. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice softer. Grace lifted her head. She had intended to say yes, but something inside her stalled. "I do not know where I am," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "And I do not know who you are, apart from the name you gave me." Nicholas nodded slightly, as though he had expected this. "My full name is Nicholas Moreau. I run several businesses, and unfortunately, I have a few enemies." "What kind of businesses?" Grace asked, her eyes never leaving his. Nicholas set his glass on the table. "The kind that do not appear on the stock exchange." Grace let out a short, humorless laugh. She was not sure whether she was angry or afraid or simply exhausted. "So what are you? Some kind of Mafia boss?" Nicholas did not smile, but he did not deny it either. He only said, "I am someone who can keep you safe, and right now that is what you need more than anything else." Grace stepped back. "I do not need to be protected. I just got pulled into something ridiculous because of a selfish ex and one stupid impulsive moment. I am not the main character in your action movie." Nicholas watched her for so long that she almost turned away. Then he moved closer, very slowly. "Grace, I know this is beyond what you can fully understand tonight, but there are worlds that exist alongside the one you know. Places where power does not live on paper, but in loyalty and fear. And tonight, somehow, you stepped into that world." Her throat felt dry. "Can I go home?" she asked. Nicholas was silent for a moment, then shook his head. "Not tonight. Are you holding me here?" "I am keeping you alive," he replied, his voice lowering, almost sorrowful. "And if you want to walk out of here tomorrow morning, I will not stop you. But at least let me protect you until then." Grace did not know what to believe. Yet in that moment his eyes held nothing but truth. A dangerous, cold truth, but absolute. And what frightened her most was that she believed him. The room fell into a heavy quiet after Nicholas spoke. Grace sat down on the velvet chair near the window, her gaze drifting into the brand. Darkness outside, where the tall buildings of Boston had become nothing more than faint points of light behind a thin veil of mist. She did not know what to think or what to trust. Everything had come too fast and felt too strange. Part of her still resisted, unwilling to accept that her life had tilted into a direction from which there would be no turning back. But another part, the one trembling deep inside, understood that the truth had begun to seep through every crack in the wall of her old unawareness. Nicholas left her alone. He walked into another room, likely an office, and closed the door softly. After sitting for a long time, Grace rose and began to wander through the apartment, as if movement itself might calm her thoughts. She stopped beside a side table near the fireplace. On it, whether by accident or intention, lay a stack of documents that had not yet been put away. She had no intention of prying, but a single line at the top of the first page caught her eye and held it. There, the line was printed in bold letters. Grace Whittaker, observation log. Her heart skipped. Her hand reached for the first sheet, a part of her mind screaming at her to stop, but the rest of her refusing to listen. On the page were photographs of her, images of her leaving her office, buying coffee at her usual corner shop, wheeling her car out of the parking lot, even one of her talking on the phone in the park. Each picture was numbered and labeled with date, time, and location. Some angles were so odd that she could not imagine where a person would have stood to take them. Grace felt the skin along her arms and back grow cold, inch by inch. She turned to the second page. It was a list of people she had seen in the past few weeks, from colleagues and neighbors to the delivery worker she saw so often. Beside each name was a brief note. Suspicious, not suspicious. Requires further observation. She saw Sarah's name, circled in red, with a notation that read, potential point of access. Grace turned away, swallowing hard. There was no doubt now that someone had been watching her in a methodical, organized way. And Nicholas had known. He had not said the words, but he had known. She walked quickly toward the office door where he had gone. It was not locked. She pushed it open and found him standing in front of a large screen, displaying a digital map dotted with clusters of red points. He turned at the sound, his eyes darkening slightly when he saw her. "You were not supposed to look at those," he said, not angry, merely stating a fact. "Those things are about me," Grace replied, her voice trembling with tension despite her effort to steady it. "Who did this?" Nicholas exhaled and stepped closer. He did not touch her, but his presence thickened the air between them. "A group that used to work for Romano. Carver Romano. He has resurfaced. He wants to rebuild his old network, and the fastest way to put pressure on me is to target someone he believes I care about." Grace drew back half a step. "Me? He thinks you care about me." Nicholas looked at her. "He does not just think so. He is convinced. And he is not the kind of man who is fooled by a simple social performance. Which means he knows you are connected to me, even if it is only for one night." It felt as if invisible hands were closing around her. "Why me? I have nothing. No power, no money, no reputation. I am just an ordinary woman." Nicholas bowed his head slightly, his voice softening. "Grace, your father once worked as an accountant for Romano. He knew too much, and his death was not an accident. I do not believe they ever truly let your family go." The room seemed to tilt. Grace had to grab the edge of the desk to keep from losing her balance. Memories of her father flickered back one by one. His words, his tired eyes in those final years. She had always believed he died in a car accident. She had never thought to question it, because no one had ever given her a reason to, until now. Nicholas moved closer, and this time placed his hand on her shoulder, not to restrain her but to stand firm beside her in the middle of the chaos. "I do not know what will happen next," he said, But I promise you will not face it alone." Grace did not look at him. At some point, tears had begun to spill over, not from fear but from the weight of truth. A truth she had never imagined could touch her, now tightening around her like a net she could not escape. And in the middle of that net, the only person standing on her side was the one she knew least. Nicholas said nothing when he felt Grace's shoulders trembling beneath his hand. Instead, he quietly withdrew, stepped toward the wall safe hidden behind a framed painting in his office, and with a few practiced motions unlocked it. Inside lay a thick bundle of files bound together with a length of faded cloth rope. He lifted it with a care Grace had never seen from him before, the cool precision of the man at the gala replaced now by a solemn stillness, the stillness of someone who knows he is about to unveil a truth that will forever alter the way another person sees their past. He set the files on the desk and pushed them toward her without a word. Grace stared at them, her fingers trembling as she untied the rope. The yellowed paper released the faint, dusty scent of long-sealed secrets, as if the pages themselves had been waiting years for air. The first sheet was an unofficial personnel summary. A portrait of her father, David Whittaker, appeared at the top wearing a light gray suit, his expression stern yet kind, his eyes behind steel-rimmed glasses so familiar they stole her breath. Grace had never really pictured him in his working years. In her memory, he was a quiet man who forgot his coat, who loved black tea on Sunday mornings, who read history books before bed. But the document before her told an entirely different story. David Whittaker, senior internal accountant for Golden Crescent Transport, confidential employee code GC112, had begun working in 1987, responsible for analyzing and coordinating internal payment routes for an international network stretching through Italy, Switzerland, and Cuba. Beneath that was a hand-drawn financial linkage chart, disturbingly detailed, connecting shell companies to a name circled in red, Romano Group Holdings. Grace flipped through the next pages quickly. Bank statements, transfer slips, handwritten memos. Her father had not only known about the laundering operations, he had processed them, and scattered throughout were handwritten notes in his familiar script, lines of protest and warnings that revealed he had never been part of the wrongdoing but had been trapped inside it. Near the end was an internal report dated 1994, with a rough title scrawled across the top, "Proposal to withdraw, potentially dangerous." That had been the year Grace was 14. She remembered how he changed, then how he grew silent, how he stayed up late, how he locked his office door at home. And then came the accident. Grace dropped the file as though it weighed 100 pounds. "They killed him," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the page. It was not an accident. Not faulty brakes like the police said. They knew he wanted out, and they did not let him go. Nicholas nodded slowly, heavily. "There is no legal evidence. But in this world, silence in the data is often the loudest proof. After your father died, the entire money flow shifted. His associates disappeared or changed identities. Romano took full control after that." Grace pressed a shaking hand to her forehead, her mind spinning. Everything she had believed about her father, about her childhood, shattered like glass. Nicholas stood still, not touching her, yet watching her with the attention of someone guarding a doorway she had to cross in, her own time. After a long while, she lifted her head, her voice cracked. "Why do you have all this? Have you been watching me?" Nicholas hesitated, then nodded once. "I knew your father. Not well, but enough to know he tried to reach me before he died. I did not think much of it until I saw your name appear on Romano's surveillance lists. Once I recognized it, I started investigating. And when you walked toward me at the gala, Grace, that was not coincidence. That was the beginning." She said nothing. She only looked at him. And in her gaze there was more than tears or anger. There was the dawning realization that every straight line in her life, every choice, every turn, had been nudged by unseen hands long before tonight. And now she had no choice but to uncover why, or risk losing herself in the dark. Grace stood motionless for a long time, as if her body had been pressed into the thick air of the truth now suffocating the room. The pages lay open before her, the light glinting off words smudged by tears she could no longer hold back. She drew in a deep breath, but her chest felt cinched tight. Nothing in her 42 years of life had prepared her for this moment. Nothing equipped her to face the fact that the father she adored, the man who taught her kindness and discipline and caution, had once been entangled in the most dangerous underworld of Boston. "No," she whispered, though she no longer believed her own voice. My father. He was not that kind of man. He would never work for someone like Romano. Nicholas stayed a few steps away, understanding that certain wounds cannot be touched, only endured. Grace, he said gently. He did not choose it. He was forced. She shook her head so hard her hair fell across her shoulders. No. He was good. He never hurt anyone. He never did anything wrong. I know, Nicholas replied softly. That is why he tried to leave. And that is why he paid the price. Grace pressed her hands to her head as pain tore through her memories. She thought of mornings with him standing by the stove, whistling softly while waiting for water to boil. She thought of nights when he pulled her blankets up and told her tomorrow would still be a beautiful day. She remembered the late bills, the little arguments with her mother that ended in laughter, the small imperfections of a normal life she had always treasured. All of it suddenly felt tainted, not false, but incomplete, heavy with the things he could never say, the danger he could never bring home. Why did he not tell me? She asked brokenly. Why did he carry all that alone? Why let me grow up blind to everything? Nicholas looked at her for a long moment before answering. Because he loved you, and sometimes love means protecting, not confessing. Grace bit her lip until she tasted blood. She could not tell whether she was angry, grieving, or simply falling into a depth of loss she had never known. He died because of Romano, she whispered. Because he tried to escape. Nicholas nodded once, firm and devastating. Yes. That single word made her whole body tremble. She began to cry openly, no longer able to contain it. The sound filled the spacious penthouse, harsh, cracked, raw, as though her heart were finally breaking after holding too much for too long. Nicholas stepped forward, then paused as if asking silently for permission. Grace did not look at him, but her shaking shoulders answered for her. He came closer, placed a hand on her back, not pulling, not enclosing, only steadying, and when she started to collapse, he gently drew her into his arms, holding her not to claim her but to keep her from falling. He tried to protect you, Nicholas murmured, his voice low like a confession. But Romano did not forget, and now, they believe it is your turn to pay. Grace clung to him as if he were the only solid thing left in a world collapsing under the weight of truth. Why me? She gasped. I do not know anything. I have nothing to do with them. Nicholas lowered his forehead to her hair. Because you are his daughter. And in this world some debts are paid in blood, not in years. Grace closed her eyes as tears fell hot against his collar, and in that moment she understood her life had split open into a direction she had never wanted and could never return from. And the only person holding her upright was the very man she should have feared most. Grace did not know how long she cried. She only knew that when the tears finally stopped, the sharp ache in her chest had given way to a strange emptiness, as though her body had rejected emotion itself to make room for a cold, unfamiliar clarity. She stepped back from Nicholas gently, yet decisively. He did not try to hold her, only retreated a single measured step, his gaze resting on her like an invisible barrier meant to shield rather than confine. Grace brushed her, hair back, straightened, and returned to the desk, where the documents about her father lay open like a silent indictment. The numbers, diagrams, annotations, they all looked like a verdict against the man she had once believed belonged solely to a world of honesty and responsibility. But beneath the grief stirring inside her rose something deeper, heavier, unease. A sense that she was not merely the victim of an old tragedy, but a piece in a game she did not yet understand, a game whose players she had never seen. She drew a deep breath, her voice hoarse but steady. What do they want from me? Nicholas watched her for a few seconds before answering, without hesitation. Not you, the power tied to your name. Grace frowned and stepped closer. My name means nothing. I am not a politician. I am not an heiress. Nicholas pulled out a thinner stack of documents and opened it in front of her. On the first page was a copy of a will she had never seen her father's estate, records listing trust funds held in Switzerland, established in 1993, 1 year before his death. Your father was not only an accountant, Nicholas said quietly. He also held the access codes to Romano's financial systems. To protect you, he transferred a portion of assets, including those codes, into a trust under your name. No one can access it without the confirmation of Grace Whitaker. Grace blinked as the world seemed to slow around her, the pieces shifting into place in a pattern she had never imagined. She was not the target because of who she was. She was the key, a tool, a final move. And if Romano could force her cooperation or make others believe she would give it, he could reach everything her father once hid. Her fists tightened until her nails bit into her palms. So everything that has happened, all of it was to push me into signing something, or to make me think I have no choice at all. Nicholas did not deny it, nor offer her comfort. He only nodded. Possibly both. Romano never plays a single game. He plays at least 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Grace let out a dry laugh, sharp and humorless. And I am the last piece on his board. No, Nicholas said, his voice low and resolute. You are the only piece he does not control. That is why you are still alive. The sentence made Grace shudder, not from fear, but from the realization she had been avoiding. If she kept stepping back, kept hiding, then she would eventually vanish the way her father had, quietly, erased, and no one but the men moving pieces behind the scenes would ever know she had existed. She lifted her chin and looked directly at Nicholas. I do not know how to fight like you. I do not have guns or power or anything except myself. He nodded slowly. But you have something none of us have. Legitimacy. Grace exhaled a tired, bitter breath. How ironic. My name is what they want, and it is the only thing I have to fight with. Nicholas lifted one shoulder in a quiet shrug. Then it is time you stop being a pawn and start being a player. She was silent for several seconds, then walked to the window where the city lights flickered through the dark like scattered embers. She knew there would be no safe road from here. But in that moment, standing between shadows and the trembling glow of truth, she made a choice. She would not let her name be used as a weapon against her. She would reclaim it. And if she had to, she would overturn the entire board herself. Grace stayed awake the entire night, staring at the ceiling of the large but cold bedroom inside Nicholas's penthouse. Everything she thought she knew about her father, her life, now carried a different shade, a deep gray of deception and danger. She could not sleep, could not shed another tear. Her mind felt bound by an invisible wire, pulled tight, and within that suffocating silence, a single thought formed clearly. She could not stay here. Whoever Nicholas truly was, whether he meant to help her or simply needed her as part of his own strategy, this was still his world, a world of control, tactics, and secrets she would never fully understand. And more importantly, she needed to choose her next step herself, not be moved like a piece waiting for someone else's turn. When the first light of dawn filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Grace rose quietly. She changed out of the loungewear Nicholas had provided and slipped into a pair of jeans and a dark sweater, brushed her hair, and left her face bare. She checked her phone, still in Nicholas's possession, for safety, so she used the room's landline instead, dialing a number she had memorized since college. 3 rings. "Sarah here," her friend answered, her voice rough with sleep. "It's me," Grace whispered. "I need you to come get me. Now. I will explain later." Sarah did not question her, only replied with her usual, decisive tone. "Give me the address." Half an hour later, Grace told Nicholas's house staff she wanted some fresh morning air. The middle-aged man nodded graciously and summoned the private elevator without suspicion. Her heart hammered wildly as she stepped inside. When the doors opened into the lobby, she walked fast, straight past the doorman, out onto the quiet street. Sarah's car waited a short distance away, engine running, passenger door already open. Grace slid in and managed only 2 words, "Drive now." Sarah hit the gas without hesitation, glancing sideways. "I thought you were going to see that ex of yours. Did you just escape from a 5-star hotel?" Grace stared out the window at the building, fading into morning fog. "Not a hotel," she said softly. "A fortress." Sarah shot her another look, this time sharper. "Grace, you look like you just walked out of a spy thriller. What did you get yourself into?" Grace said nothing. Not until they had turned onto a quiet residential street. Then she finally faced her friend. "I cannot go home. Can I stay with you for a while?" Sarah did not hesitate. "As long as you need. But Grace, you are scaring me. What did you get out of?" Grace let her head fall back against the seat, closing her eyes as if trying to erase the images that refused to leave her. "A web," she whispered, "and if I am not careful, it will pull us both in." Sarah tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her expression hardening. "Then I will help you cut it loose. 1 strand at a time. Grace opened her eyes and looked at her friend with a mixture of gratitude and dread, because she sensed, with a certainty that chilled her, that the moment they drove away from the penthouse was also the moment the watchers would begin to act. And this time, there might be no one standing between her and the danger closing in. Sarah's car turned onto the narrow road leading to the small cluster of houses in the southern part of Cambridge, the place she had called home for the past 3 years since moving out of the city center. The neighborhood was quiet, the trees lining the street already stripped of most of their leaves, their bare branches lacing together overhead like the cold fingers of winter. When Sarah cut the engine in front of the familiar white gate, Grace exhaled, feeling as if she had finally slipped free of a nightmare that had stretched on through the night. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked as they stepped out of the car, her gaze sweeping quickly over the property, the alertness in her voice sharpened by the panicked call she had received that morning. "I am not sure of anything," Grace replied, "but at least here there is no one watching every step I take." They went inside. Sarah locked the door twice and switched on the lights. The small house warmed around them the way it always did, the faint scent of old coffee and lavender oil lingering in the cushions and on the tablecloth. Grace looked around, and the simple familiarity of it all nearly brought her to tears with relief. She shrugged off her coat and dropped into the chair near the window, resting the back of her head against the wall. "Give me 10 minutes to remember how to breathe," she murmured, closing her eyes. Sarah nodded and slipped into the kitchen, making coffee the way she had on so many Sunday mornings they had shared. But only a few minutes later, as she was spooning coffee into the filter, she felt a chill brush the back of her neck. She froze. The house that usually felt so warm suddenly seemed unnaturally still, as if the very air had been pressed flat. No cars passing outside, no birds, not even the whisper of leaves. Too quiet. She edged back toward the living room. Grace was still there, but no longer leaning against the wall. Her body was tense, her hands gripping the armrests of the chair, her eyes fixed on the window. Sarah followed her gaze, and her heart tightened. A figure stood just beyond the front porch, almost swallowed by the shadow of the trees. One glance at his posture, the way he held his shoulders, and Sarah understood at once that this was not a mail carrier. Without a word, she stepped quickly back into the kitchen, pulled her phone from her pocket, and unlocked the screen, only to see that every signal had vanished. No service, no wireless connection. Nothing. "Grace," she whispered as she came back into the room, but before she could say more, the window beside them shattered. The crash of glass exploded through the room, layered over their startled cries, as a canister clattered across the floor and rolled to a stop, spilling a thick white smoke that burned their lungs and stung their eyes. Grace coughed violently, pressing an arm over her mouth and nose as her vision blurred. Sarah grabbed for her, trying to haul her up, but the front door burst inward with a single kick. 3 figures in dark clothing and masks swept into the room without a word. One carried a pistol fitted with a suppressor, the second already had a roll of tape in his hand, and the third headed straight for Grace. Sarah reacted on instinct, snatching a glass carafe from a nearby shelf and hurling it at the man with the gun, but she was knocked to the floor by a brutal blow to the stomach before she could draw breath again. Grace tried to run, but it was already too late. They moved with the precision of men who had done this many times before, trained and coordinated, each motion part of a practiced pattern. In less than 30 seconds, both women were on the ground, their hands bound tightly behind their backs, their mouths sealed with tape. One of the men leaned close to Grace's ear, his voice a harsh rasp like rusted metal. "Welcome back to the board, Miss Whitaker. It is time you met the man in charge." Grace glared at him, her heart pounding so hard it seemed to shake her ribs. She understood that in that single moment, whatever control she had fought to reclaim had slipped away again, and this time, Nicholas was nowhere near to stop the worst from happening. The gray truck glided along the empty suburban roads like a ghost slipping through the heavy morning fog. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of metal, dampness, and fear. Grace's wrists were tied behind her back, her mouth still gagged, her body thrown slightly to the side with each sharp turn. Sarah was bound beside her, eyes wide with terror, her own mouth taped, yet her gaze held steady when it met Grace's, trying to say that she was still there, still with her. Their captors did not speak. 3 men sat across from them, silent as living machines. Only the growling engine and the occasional crackle of a radio from the front seats broke the quiet. Grace had no idea where they were being taken, but she knew with certainty it would not be anywhere public. Each passing minute felt like a second counted backward on a clock whose hands she could not see. She forced herself not to fall fully into panic. She repeated one thought in her mind, again and again. Nicholas will know. Nicholas will not let this happen. Then, almost at once, another doubt cut through. Could she still believe that? The truck finally slowed and stopped after nearly an hour of driving. One of the men rose, peeled the tape from Grace's and Sarah's mouths, but left their wrists bound. He bent forward, his voice coarse and clipped. "Do not scream. No one is coming." The rear doors swung open, and a pale morning light spilled into the dark interior. Outside stood a deserted industrial complex, rows of rusted warehouses, peeling concrete walls, and sagging fences, crowned with stained coils of barbed wire that made the whole place look like a temporary prison for people no one would miss. They were dragged from the truck, their cramped legs shaky beneath them. A heavy metal door creaked open nearby, the long, grating sound echoing across the empty yard like a grim announcement. Grace was shoved inside first, her eyes quickly taking in the interior of the warehouse. Rough concrete walls, a high ceiling with flickering fluorescent tubes, a few metal chairs scattered across the floor, security cameras mounted in the corners, and a large table in the center with a neat stack of files resting on top, as if someone had been waiting for them to arrive. Sarah was forced into a chair beside her, wrists still bound, her breathing quick and shallow, her gaze constantly roaming the room, searching for any flaw, any opening. A different man stepped into view, this one without a mask. He wore a black shirt, an old gold watch on his wrist, his graying hair combed carefully back. His face was hard, the kind of hardness that came from years of pressure rather than impulse. Grace knew immediately who he was, the man people spoke about in low voices but rarely by name, Carver Romano. He sat down on the chair opposite them, placed his hands on the table, fingers interlaced as though preparing to begin a negotiation instead of an interrogation. "Grace Whittaker," he said, his deep voice carrying an easy, measured English touched with a faint Italian cadence. "At last. You look more like your father than I expected." Grace tightened her hands into fists behind her back. She kept her face as still as she could, though her heart pounded so loudly she was sure he could hear it. Romano tilted his head, studying her like a man parsing the lines of an old document for hidden meaning. "I am not planning to kill you, if that is what you are afraid of," he continued calmly. "I need you alive, but I do need your cooperation." Grace's lips curled into a small, bitter smile. "I have nothing you want." Romano laughed softly, a brief sound, but full of meaning. "Everything I want is contained in a single signature." He tapped his fingers lightly on the stack of papers in front of him. "Your father left a few gifts behind before he exited the stage. Unfortunately, only someone named Grace Whittaker can unwrap them." Grace swallowed, but did not look away. "And if I refuse?" Romano's smile did not fade. It simply shifted, his eyes flicking toward Sarah, who sat restrained in the corner of the room. "Then your charming friend pays first, then you. But I do not think you are the selfish type." Grace bit her lip until she tasted blood, yet she refused to drop her gaze. She knew that every word, every breath, was being weighed. This was more than a kidnapping. It was a game, and she had been placed in the middle of the board like a queen already surrounded. But there was one thing Romano did not know. She had learned how to play, and she had no intention of moving in any direction that served only to save herself. Nicholas stood motionless in the dark room, the cold blue light from the computer monitor carving sharp angles across his face. Every line of it looked as if it had been chiseled from stone, his eyes unblinking as they fixed on the latest satellite image, a derelict warehouse south of the Everett Industrial District, surrounded by high fencing with a single point of entry. In the grainy frame, the gray truck he had tracked through traffic cameras sat parked at the door just before dawn. She had been there, Grace, and he had let this happen. Marco entered without removing his coat, a stack of documents in one hand, a tablet glowing with fresh updates in the other. "Confirmed," Marco said, his voice low and urgent. A brief signal came from a disabled phone in that area about half an hour ago. Same encrypted frequency Grace used back when she worked at the bank. "I think she tried to send a distress call." Nicholas clenched his jaw, bracing his hands against the table. 100 scenarios raced through his mind, and not one of them allowed failure. Not this time. Not with Grace. How many guards? He asked, never looking away from the woe. Floor plan. Marco expanded the thermal scan. At least 5 on the perimeter. 2 at the front entrance. 1 on the mezzanine, likely a sniper. Inside, 3 heat signatures. 1 moving, probably Carver Romano. 2 stationary, almost certainly Grace and her friend. Nicholas nodded, his thoughts sharpening into action. How long before he forces her to sign? Marco shook his head. Not long. Romano always starts with psychological pressure. He will not hurt Grace first. He will use the friend. Nicholas raised his head, his gaze cutting like a blade. Then we get in before he starts. He crossed to the weapons rack, unlocked the safe, and retrieved his familiar handgun and 2 spare magazines. Marco watched him with a sigh. Nicholas, I know you are good, but going in without a full team is suicide. I do not need a team, Nicholas replied, his voice calm and unyielding. I need you. Someone who can move without making noise. Someone who does not ask questions. And someone who understands this is not about justice. This is personal. Marco nodded, sliding a silenced weapon into place. Then we do it the old way. Nicholas's lips curved, though there was no relief in the gesture, only a quiet, icy resolve. Yes. The old way. Within 10 minutes they were ready. The warehouse layout was divided into 3 sections. An abandoned administrative wing, the main storage area where the hostages were held, and a rear annex, narrow enough to serve as their point of infiltration. Nicholas chose the back route, crawling through a disused cargo duct coated in dust and spiderwebs, while Marco circled wide to neutralize the outer guards without revealing their presence. They had exactly 1 chance. 1 moment to bring Grace out alive. Nicholas glanced once at the last photo he had of her taken that night at the gala, her eyes still raw from seeing Ethan, her smile trembling as she walked toward him with desperate determination. She had stepped into all of this because of a small wound, and now she was paying with her life. He tightened his grip on the gun, his expression darkening. I am coming, Grace, he whispered. And this time, I am not coming as the man pretending to be your boyfriend. I am coming to end this. Night fell like a thick curtain over the abandoned industrial district, the cold wind slicing through rusted sheets of metal, moaning like forgotten screams caught between the structures. In that darkness, 2 figures moved low to the ground, merging with the shadows as though they were born from them. Nicholas led, senses honed to the razor's edge, listening for the slightest shift in air, the smallest scrape of metal. The gun in his hand felt like an extension of his body. Marco followed, his silenced weapon steady, his eyes sweeping the rooftop guards and high corners. They exchanged no words. They no longer needed them. Nicholas raised 2 fingers, signaling toward a half-blocked side, door covered with bent iron slats. They pressed close, and Marco slid a thin metal tool into the rusty lock, levering it aside with a faint click, a sound that echoed like a warning bell in the dark. The door opened just wide enough for them to slip through. Inside, shadows clung to the walls, broken only by flickering bulbs in a far corridor. The air smelled of mold, dust, old fuel. They moved quickly and silently, each footstep measured. At the junction leading to the main warehouse, Nicholas stopped. Voices drifted toward them, soft but clear. Romano's voice, cold and laced with disdain. All you need to do is sign. I do not want to dirty my hands tonight, Grace answered, her voice trembling but firm. And I do not want to die the way my father did. If you want it so badly, kill me. Nicholas's hand tightened into a fist, fury sparking behind his eyes. He slid forward, finding the exact angle to look through the rotting doorframe. The warehouse opened into a large room drenched in harsh fluorescent light. 4 armed guards stood spaced around the perimeter. 1 held Sarah, another hovered near Grace. 2 more scanned the room. Romano sat at the head of the table, his chin resting on his hand, his eyes fixed on Grace like knives. Marco lowered himself beside Nicholas and whispered, 2 on the left. You take the right. I will cover the center. Nicholas nodded. 3 seconds after my signal. He raised his hand, counted silently, then snapped his leg forward, kicking the door open with explosive force. Metal slammed against concrete with a thunderous crash. Gunfire erupted instantly. Nicholas fired twice, 1 shot burying into the shoulder of the man holding Sarah, the second tearing into the thigh of the guard near Grace. Marco swept in from behind, disarming one guard with a swift strike before knocking him unconscious with a blow to the neck. Romano lurched to his feet, but Nicholas was on him within a heartbeat, pressing the gun to his forehead. "Sit down," he snarled, the fury in his voice hot enough to scorch. Grace gasped, her breathing ragged, but her eyes widened in a burst of relief when she saw him. "You really came," she whispered. Nicholas did not look at her. His focus remained locked on Romano. "I keep my promises." Marco cut Sarah's restraints, then hurried to free Grace. "We have to move. They might call reinforcements." Nicholas turned to Grace, his gaze softening. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though her body still trembled. "I can." He glanced back at Romano, his gun never wavering. "We are leaving. If you or your men follow us, I swear I will end this somewhere you will never see coming." Romano gave a low, mocking laugh, brushing a smear of blood from his temple. "She will return to me eventually. Blood does not wash clean, Nicholas." Nicholas's jaw clenched, but he did not answer. Instead, he stepped back, shielding Grace and Sarah as Marco led them through the rear exit. The four of them slipped into the night, leaving behind the smoke-filled warehouse and the man who had just lost the most valuable piece on his board. The black SUV sliced through the nearly empty highway, its tires humming against the asphalt while Grace and Sarah sat trembling in the back seat, their breaths still uneven, their bodies unable to forget the echo of danger. Nicholas sat in the front beside Marco, his shoulder darkened by a spreading stain of blood, his jacket torn open along one side. Yet he remained silent as if the wound belonged to someone else. When the vehicle pulled into an isolated corner far from Sarah's neighborhood, Marco turned around and said, "This is far enough. You need to get home. Do not contact Grace for a while." Sarah leaned across the seat and hugged Grace tightly. "You be careful." "You too," Grace whispered. Sarah slipped out of the car and disappeared into the shadows, and the SUV rolled forward again, carrying Grace and Nicholas toward the safe house by the lake. The air inside the vehicle thickened until every breath felt weighted, as though survival and dread were woven into the same thread. Grace watched Nicholas from the back seat, unable to look away. Marco glanced occasionally through the rearview mirror but said nothing. None of them spoke. No one wanted to break the fragile stillness clinging to them like a second skin. Only when they turned onto the dirt road leading to the lake house, an escape Nicholas had prepared long before any of them imagined this night, did Grace finally find her voice, thin and rough. "You are bleeding, Nicholas." He glanced at her and tried for a faint smile. "Just a scratch." "That is not a scratch," she shot back, her voice rising with fear and anger. "You are losing blood. You are not invincible." Marco stopped the car. "We are here. I will check the perimeter. The two of you go in first." He did not need to say more. All three of them understood this was the moment to step aside, to leave space for whatever had been building in silence between Grace and Nicholas. Nicholas opened the door and gestured for her to enter. She stepped into the small wooden house, simple, warm, its soft amber lights and waiting fireplace offering a gentleness the night had cruelly denied them. When he followed her in, she turned, and for the first time since their paths had crossed, her eyes held no suspicion, no fear, no guarded edge. Only a fragile tenderness edged with anger at what he had risked. "Sit," she said, a tone that allowed no refusal. He exhaled but obeyed. Grace found the first aid kit, pulled a chair close, and knelt before him. When she cut away the torn fabric at his shoulder, she saw the blood dried in dark streaks against his skin. The bullet had grazed him, leaving a long, shallow slash, not deep but ugly enough to clench her heart. Her hands trembled as she cleaned the wound. "Why would you risk your life? Like that?" she whispered. Nicholas looked at her, and for the first time he did not hide the turmoil in his eyes. "Because if I lost you, I would never forgive myself." Her hand stilled. A tear slipped down her cheek, falling onto the gauze. "I thought I was just a pawn," she murmured. "But when you walked in tonight, I realized you were not saving a pawn." "You were saving me," Nicholas nodded, his voice low and steady as midnight wind. "From the moment you walked toward me at that gala, I knew you were not like the others. You came at me like a sudden gust, disrupting everything I thought was safe, and I could not let you vanish." Grace leaned in without hesitating this time, brushing her lips to his. It was not hurried or fierce, only deep, certain, and steady, like a promise formed quietly at the center of a storm. When they parted, Nicholas cupped her cheek, his rough fingers trembling with gentleness. "I cannot promise I will keep you safe forever," he whispered, "but I can promise I will fight for you until my last breath." Grace smiled through her tears. "Then do not go anywhere, Nicholas. Stay, with me." He looked at her, his eyes softening in a way she had never seen. Then he nodded. In that small cabin tucked deep within the woods, they were no longer fugitives, no longer hunted souls. They were simply two people who had found each other in a world coming undone. When dawn finally arrived, weaving pale gold through the dense pines and spilling over the quiet cabin, everything seemed still, as though the night had never carried gunfire, never tasted blood, never whispered threats into their dreams. But Nicholas knew better. Peace was a temporary guest in his world. He stood at the window, staring down the narrow forest path where Marco had already erased tire tracks at first light. Fresh bandages wrapped his shoulder, the dried blood gone. Yet the deeper wound, the one carved by fear of what lay ahead, remained raw. Grace approached quietly, wrapped in a soft wool sweater, her eyes still rimmed red from a sleepless night but steadier than before. She stood beside him without speaking, and the silence between them settled as something shared, rather than something separating them. Nicholas finally turned to her, his voice low. "We cannot stay here much longer. Romana will not let this go." Grace nodded without hesitation. She understood. Their world did not allow peaceful mornings to last. "You already have a plan," she said softly. "There is a place," he answered. "A small cabin in Vermont, deep in the woods, known to no one. It is the safest place for you right now. I will take you there, then return to Boston." Grace looked at him sharply. "Alone?" Nicholas gave a faint, weary smile. "I need to work with the Bureau. There are agreements that must be put on the table. Romana will not fall to a gun. He will fall to evidence." Grace was quiet for a long moment before she whispered, "And if you do not come back?" Nicholas held her gaze. "I will come back, no matter what." They left less than an hour later. Marco had already gone ahead to clear any lingering traces, and Nicholas and Grace climbed into an old jeep with false plates, rumbling away from the lake house and into the thinning morning mist. They said nothing as the road wound through the forest, not out of discomfort but because both were silently holding on to the fragile nearness between them, knowing larger forces might soon tear them apart. When they crossed the state line, Nicholas checked the mirrors one last time. No one followed. He inhaled deeply, steadying himself for what awaited him. Grace looked out the window, clutching the edge of her coat. "For the first time in my life," she said quietly, "I do not know what waits ahead, but I know if you say you will come back, I will wait." Nicholas reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "And if I say, I will never leave you, would you believe me?" Grace turned, her eyes locking with his. "I would." They continued north, the road winding through early snow on the mountainside. Fear still curled somewhere in Grace's chest, and questions without answers still gathered like shadows, but in the midst of all the uncertainty, there was one truth she held onto as her compass. Nicholas had saved her more than once, and now he was leading her away from the darkest place she had ever known, not by force, but by a promise she wanted, perhaps needed, to believe in for the first time in many years. 3 days after leaving Grace in the secluded cabin deep within the forests of Vermont, Nicholas returned to Boston a changed man. Gone was the cold figure who once hid behind tailored black suits and eyes that measured every movement around him. In his place was someone stripped down to a single truth. A man who had chosen to abandon everything he once controlled in order to protect the only thing that still mattered. When he stepped through the glass doors of the federal building housing the Bureau's headquarters, he did not hide, did not lower his gaze, did not avoid the recognition scanners that swept across his face. He let them register him. He let the 3 security officers rush toward him before one whispered into another's ear, shifting their stance in an instant. "Mr. Nicholas Moreau, please follow me," one of the agents said, his voice flat and formal. Nicholas nodded, offering no explanation, and walked down a long, sterile corridor, into an elevator that carried them to the 8th floor, then into a windowless conference room, humming faintly with fluorescent light. Inside were 2 people. Senior Agent Matthew Rourke, the man who had been tracking the Romana organization for nearly a decade, and an austere federal legal counsel whose hand rested atop a thick stack of sealed files. "We thought you were dead," Rourke said, his gaze sweeping Nicholas from head to toe as though searching for signs of a trap. Nicholas pulled out a chair and sat, never looking away from the agent. "I am here to trade a life for justice," he said quietly, "and it is not my own." Rourke leaned back, arms crossing over his chest. "We heard you turned against Romano. We heard about the warehouse incident. But let me make something clear, we do not work with criminals unless there is an exceptionally compelling reason." Nicholas reached into his leather bag, withdrew a hard drive, and set it on the table. 10 years of Romano's financial operations, he said. Money laundering routes, shadow accounts, intermediary fronts, and evidence of bribes paid to state-level officials. The legal counsel connected the device to her laptop and began to sift through its contents, her eyes sharpening. Rourke did not look away from Nicholas. "And what do you want?" Nicholas leaned back slightly. "Protection for Grace Whitaker, her name erased from every angle of this investigation. No subpoenas, no questioning, no surveillance. She is the only innocent person in this entire rotten game." The legal counsel exchanged a glance with Rourke before nodding slowly. "If what is here is legitimate, we can indict at least 30 individuals. If you provide testimony, plus the additional evidence you claim to have, we can negotiate terms." Nicholas nodded once. "I will sign anything. But Grace must walk away free, untouched, unafraid, and never see a federal badge at her door." Rourke studied him for several seconds before extending a hand. "If you keep your word, we will keep ours." Their handshake was brief but unyielding, binding one man to justice and the other to the irreversible path of betrayal. By the time Nicholas stepped outside, the sky had dimmed into a muted winter gray. Boston lay beneath a soft veil of early-season snow, the streets quiet as if bracing themselves for a secret, too heavy to speak aloud. Nicholas stood in the middle of the sidewalk and looked up at the thick clouds overhead. He knew now that his past would be buried in sealed files, and whatever future awaited him would have no road back. But as long as Grace lived free of fear, her name untouched, her life unshadowed, the price was worth paying. Snow continued to fall as Grace stood by the wooden window of the tiny Vermont cabin, her hands wrapped around a ceramic mug still warm with the scent of cinnamon tea, her eyes tracing the slow sway of pine branches in the winter wind. More than a week had passed since Nicholas had left her with nothing but a promise, and a final kiss that still lingered in her chest like the faint warmth of cooling embers. Each morning she told herself that today she would stop waiting, stop glancing toward the tree line, as if his tall silhouette might appear at any moment through the drifting snow. But each night, when the flames in the fireplace danced across the thighs, wooden walls and the cabin grew too quiet, so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat, a hollow ache opened inside her, as though part of her had been carried away with him. At first she tried to keep her mind busy. She cleaned the cabin, stacked wood, cooked simple meals, read books, even wrote a few pages in a journal like she used to do when she was a girl. But none of it filled the emptiness Nicholas had left behind. Because he was not simply the man who had saved her from Romano. He was the first person to look at her without flinching, to see the truth inside her, the wounds she had hidden even from herself, the memories she had long tried to bury. Every night before bed, she checked the satellite phone he had given her, scrolling for messages, for a signal, for anything. And every night she tucked it away again, her heart sinking a little more. No messages, no calls, no sign he was safe, or alive, or anywhere close to a world she could reach. And yet she believed. Believed in the way he had looked at her the night he left, the way he had held her hand, as if he could pour all his courage into her through his grip. Sometimes she considered driving back to the city on her own, searching for news, asking about arrests or raids. But then she remembered his voice, the way he had looked at her as though her survival alone made everything he carried bearable. So she stayed not out of fear, but out of trust. One night, when the snow fell in its heaviest curtain yet, the power flickered out for nearly an hour. Grace sat by the fireplace, lit only by the deep red glow of burning logs. She took out an old photograph of herself and her father, set it beside her, and whispered into the quiet, as though speaking to both men who had reshaped her life in ways she had never imagined. One had left secrets behind, the other had stepped willingly into darkness so she could step into the light. "I do not know if I am as strong as people think," she said softly, "but if Nicholas comes back, I promise I will not run anymore." Then she closed her eyes and leaned her head back, letting the wind against the cabin walls, and the restless breath of the forest carry her into sleep. It was a brief rest, but for the first time since he left, it was not heavy with dread, because somewhere deep inside her, quiet as a heartbeat, she could feel him drawing closer. Nicholas's agreement with the Bureau had taken effect. As part of the witness protection program, Grace was given a new identity. 3 months later, she lived in a small coastal town in the state of Maine, a place where white-painted wooden houses dotted the rolling hills that sloped gently toward a vast, silver-gray ocean. The wind there always carried a taste of salt and the distant cry of seabirds, so that every morning began with a sense of peace tinged with a faint ache, like an old scar healed long ago yet still tender when memory brushed against it. She rented a small 2-story house with a balcony facing the sea, and each morning she stepped out with a cup of coffee, quietly watching the fishing boats drift from the harbor. Life there was simple and slow, the people kind, no one asking who she was or where she had come from. She worked part-time at a tiny bookshop in the center of town, where old Mr. Murray loved to tell stories of ghost ships and sailors who vanished into the fog. Grace often sat by the large window arranging books, smiling to herself as she listened to the local children argue about those tales, as though they had lived them. But when the town settled into its evening hush, when only the steady breath of waves against the shore and the amber glow of window lights remained, she missed Nicholas with an ache that refused to soften. Though there had been no word from him for 3 long months, though the satellite phone he left for her lay tucked in a drawer with its battery drained, she never allowed herself to believe he was gone forever. Each time she walked the path along the beach, her bare feet sinking into the cold, wet sand, she imagined him beside her, quiet in that way he always had been, but present in every heartbeat, as though she needed only to turn her head to see him there. Once, at a small cafe overlooking the sea, where the server knew she preferred cinnamon tea to coffee, and always kept a seat waiting by the window, an old man at the next table asked her, "Are you waiting for someone?" Grace had smiled gently. "I think I am not waiting anymore. I am living." But in her heart she knew that was only half the truth. The other half continued to hope in silence, because real love does not need loud proof or eternal promises. It needs only one reason to survive belief, and her belief in Nicholas had never faded. That evening, the sea was strangely calm. The last light of day stretched across the water like a sheet of gold, and gentle waves chased one another across the sand. Grace was watering the flowers on her porch when she heard slow footsteps approaching behind her. At first she did not turn, thinking it was only Mr. Murray dropping by with a new book. But then a voice spoke, a deep, familiar voice that struck through her like a pulse remembered. He said, "I came back, Grace." The hose slipped from her hand as she froze, suspended between reality and a dream she had barely allowed herself to dream. When she turned, Nicholas stood there in the glow of the setting sun, as impossible and undeniable as breath itself. The same eyes, the same face, only now there was exhaustion in them, and peace. He had kept his word. He had returned. Grace walked toward him without hesitation, without a single question or trace of anger. She simply wrapped her arms around him, as though afraid that if she did not touch him, he might vanish again. Nicholas held her tightly and whispered that it was over. Romano had been arrested. He had provided the evidence, and now he was under protection as well. But more than anything, he had chosen to let go of the life he once lived, to begin again in the only place his heart had ever been drawn to. They stayed in that small seaside town, building a quiet life with no danger, no shadows, no operations hidden behind closed doors. Mornings spent walking the beach together, afternoons reading on the porch, evenings looking at one another as if the world had finally fallen silent enough for them to exist fully, gently, undeniably. The story of Grace and Nicholas was not simply a love that survived danger. It was the story of choosing, of trusting, of releasing what hurt in order to hold on to what mattered most. It was peace. It was the person you want to wake beside every morning. It was the embrace that reminds you you are no longer alone in a world too vast to navigate by yourself. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson we can draw from their journey, that sometimes the most beautiful things do not come from perfection, but from sincerity and the courage to love again after we have been broken. And you, how did this story touch you? Did it remind you of someone in your life? Did any part of Grace and Nicholas's journey echo something within your own? We would truly love to hear the feelings that rose from your heart. Leave a comment below and share your story with us. And if you were moved by their journey, Do not forget to like, share this video with someone you care about, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss the meaningful, emotional stories we tell each day. Thank you for walking with us through this journey. Wishing you and your loved ones health, joy, and peace in every day to come. Farewell for now, and we will see you in the next video.